Charles II, son of Charles I, technically became king in 1649 when his father died, but he, too, lived as a refugee on the continent and wandered rather aimlessly around Europe after a failed attempt to regain his crown in 1651. When Cromwell died in 1658, however, the English Republic collapsed, and pretty soon Parliament started to think that the monarchy wasn't such a bad idea after all. Charles II returned to England in triumph in 1660. During his reign, England's overseas colonies grew and prospered, and England tightened its control over colonial trade, ticking off both the colonists and the Dutch traders who dominated the Atlantic trading system. England went to war with the Netherlands twice during Charles' reign as the battle for commercial supremacy heightened. When Charles died without a legitimate heir in 1685, his brother James II took the English throne. James was not a popular king. He was Catholic, and that made his Protestant subjects uncomfortable at the least, and, in the end, rebellious. James didn't help the situation much when he insisted on favoring his fellow Catholics for high governmental positions, even when they were not necessarily the best qualified. After only 3 years, English Protestants decided that they had reached the limits of their tolerance. They invited James' Protestant nephew, William of Orange, who was also married to James' daughter Mary, to make a change. William arrived in England to lead an army against the king in 1688. Many Englishmen rose up to support him, and James panicked. The king grabbed his wife and son, the legitimate heir, and fled to France, essentially abdicating his throne. William and Mary ascended to the monarchy in what soon became known as the Glorious Revolution. The reign of William III and Mary II was a bit different from that of previous kings and queens. In return for their throne, William and Mary had to swear an oath that they would defend Protestantism in England. They also had to agree to some strict limitations on their power. Parliament was now in charge, and the monarchs agreed to let this governing body control legislation and taxation. They also had to promise not to interfere with the elections or free speech, and they could not raise an army without Parliament's consent or hold their own courts. This 1689 Bill of Rights guaranteed that Parliament would be permanent and powerful. During William and Mary's reign, England fought the 9 Years' War with France from 1689 to 1697. Catholic France, of course, wanted to put James back on England's throne and wouldn't have opposed taking over a few of England's colonies in the process. The war proved to be financially exhausting, and England and France finally negotiated peace with hardly any change in the status quo. William and Mary died in 1702 and 1694, respectively, without leaving any heirs. The 1701 Act of Settlement had declared that only Protestants could hold the throne in England, so the logical choice fell to Mary's sister Anne, who assumed her reign in 1702. Once again, France tried to intervene to place Anne's Catholic brother on England's throne, as well as to secure the Spanish throne and colonial and commercial supremacy. This war lasted for nearly all of Anne's reign, not ending until 1713, when England agreed to accept France's choice for Spain's monarch in return for maintaining its own choice of succession. When Anne died in 1714, the Stuart family was out of options. Anne's children had all preceded her in death. The Stuart descendants still left in France were Catholic and therefore not eligible. England had to turn its attention to Germany to find a suitable candidate, and King George I of the House of Hanover assumed the throne.
Queen Anne has died. There are no Protestant Stuarts left. The Protestant line to the English throne now passes through James's granddaughter, Sophia, who had married a German prince with the title of Elector of Hanover, and then from her to her son George Louis, who's inherited that antiquated title. At the opening of Parliament, King George stood in silence while his words were read by the Lord Chamberlain. The crown that had belonged to Normans, French Plantagenets, Welsh Tudors, and Scottish Stuarts had now passed to the German Hanoverians. Princess Sophia Dorothea had come to detest her husband, who spent his time either engaged in endless European wars or enjoying his various mistresses. Her son, George Augustus, never forgave his father. In fact, father-son detestation would be the defining mark of the Hanoverian dynasty. They thrived on it. And there were Scottish noblemen who thought that with George lacking support in England, this might be an opportunity to hand the throne back to the Stuart family, and in particular to James II's son, living in France and known as the Pretender. The Jacobite Rising of 1715 was a complete flop, and after spending a couple of months wandering around the Highlands, James went home to France. George's throne was safe. He spent every winter in Hanover and left the government of England to his ministers. His own work was done by a new figure, the Prime Minister, a politician acting as a king's substitute. The first man to take on this role was Robert Walpole. Since Walpole didn't speak German, the pair of them communicated in schoolboy Latin. King George died a sudden death in 1727 while in Hanover, aged 67. King George was a fighting man, like his father, head of the army, and very much engaged in the quarrels between the rulers of continental Europe. Walpole tried hard to keep him out of wars, but in 1739 the king got his way and England went to war with Spain. This was the start of a steadily growing involvement in the power struggle between France, Prussia and the Habsburg Empire. Its culmination for George came in June 1743. He found himself under attack by the French at a German village called Dettingen. His horse bolted, but George stood in front of his troops, waved his sword, and made a rather ponderous but actually rather brave little speech. And so he became the last English king to lead his troops in battle. It was a fierce fight, and George emerged a bit of a hero. But he didn't rule the country. Governments and ministers came and went not because he wanted them, but because Parliament wanted them. In fact, George called himself a prisoner on the throne. In 1745, he played no part in the battles of Prestonpans or Culloden, which were far more important to the throne than the Battle of Dettingen. After all, they were battles for the throne itself. James's son, the Pretender, had tried and failed to take the throne in 1715, and now, 30 years on, he was known as the Old Pretender. His son Charles, born in Rome, was the Young Pretender. Charles Casimir was 25 years old, pale, thin, romantic and brave. And he decided that George was so unpopular it would be a doddle to take over. He turned up at his own expense in the Hebrides and summoned the Scottish clans. Most of them responded, but out of a combination of loyalty and desperation rather than conviction. The rebels took Manchester, then Derby. London trembled, but not as much as the clansmen. They'd marched expecting England to rise in their support and the French to invade. Instead, they had no support at all. Most fundamentally, they realized that the English would never accept a Roman Catholic king. They'd outflanked a large English army, but it was now on their tail, and another was coming up from London. So back they went. And the clansmen were finally slaughtered in their thousands at Culloden in April 1746. George also found his other great enemy removed. His son Frederick died in 1751. He'd been hit hard in the stomach by a tennis ball, and the resulting abdominal ulcer burst and killed him. The new heir to the throne was a 12-year-old child, Frederick's son, George. But the great problems of the kingdom were outside the king's grasp. His country was now a great imperial trading power, with huge involvements in India, the East Indies, North America, and the Mediterranean. So was France. At the same time, continental Europe was constantly boiling over into war, and Hanover was in the middle of that. In 1756, the great powers finally locked horns in a do-or-die struggle that would girdle the whole world. This would become the 7 Years' War. It was truly the First World War. Britain fought in the name of its king, but that king now neither directed policy nor took part in the battles. A new world. In fact, affairs were so far out of the king's control that when he dismissed ministers he didn't like, they came right back again. So far as the English were concerned, this was just how things ought to be. Englishmen were entitled to liberty. The despots were on the other side, Catholic France and Austria. Their whole life, commerce, industry, and fighting force was directed by royal tyrants who ruled over starving and powerless peasants. And on the other side, Protestant Britain, whose commerce was run by men of business, whose industry was directed by free tradesmen, whose army and navy were run by heroes and manned by proud free men, and whose court was the centre of society, not of autocratic power. And that was how many of the British really did see it. Of course, they were also fighting despotic Prussia, but that was a minor detail.
The general perception was that this was a war of free Britons against European despots. Poor George died at the height of the war in 1760, and it didn't matter at all. His grandson, now George III, was 22 years old. He immediately set to work as a bossy, quick-speaking, managerial king. He read widely, he was fascinated by machinery and agriculture, he was a man delighted by the agricultural and industrial revolutions, and he was determined to restore the crown to what he saw as its proper position, a position abandoned, in his view, by Georges I and II. Unlike them, he'd been born in England and spoke good English even if his grasp of grammar was ropey, and he had no old or young pretender to challenge him. Parliament was controlled by one party, the Whigs, effectively an oligarchy of rich men who ran the country by a system of bribery, patronage, and nepotism. George felt that it was his job to improve matters. And so began the most catastrophic reign since James II. If it hadn't been for George III's attempt to turn back the clock, the inhabitants of New York might still be using British passports. The issue now was that the 13 English colonies in America had their own governments, run by their own local oligarchies, and raising their own taxes. The idea that they could be taxed by the oligarchy in London, headed by the king, was totally outrageous. The colonists in America were showing their anger by refusing to import anything from Britain. Lord North decided the best thing to do was repeal all the taxes on them except for a symbolic tax on tea. 3 years later, he arranged another Act of Parliament to try to help the East India Company sell more tea in America, and radicals in Boston retaliated with a symbolic tea party, at which men dressed as Native Americans dumped the tea in the harbour. The reaction in England, stirred by the popular press, was that the colonists must be punished. George certainly shared that view. Blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. Misunderstanding the strength of feeling and of organisation against them, the government tried to use too little force and triggered a full-scale rebellion. The rebel colonists proclaimed their independence in 1776, and with the backing of a large part of popular opinion in England, George was determined to fight them and crush them. The result, as many less warlike Englishmen had been warning, was disaster for England. Even Lord North wanted out, but George was in charge. The American Revolutionary War became a campaign not against unjust government or English rule, but against the very principle of monarchic government.
George's determination to be active in government and place himself at the heart of politics created a new republican movement, a language in which to attack the rule of kings. The Peace of Versailles in 1783 forced Britain to recognize the United States of America.
He certainly fretted about the American disaster, and perhaps it was his own sense of failure that made him display signs of mental disturbance in 1788, talking incessantly and behaving oddly. His doctor thought making him bleed would help. When that failed, the Prince of Wales took over the treatment.
Finally, new physicians were brought in who gave the king gentler treatment, and he recovered. In 1801, before the arguments over how the regency would function had been resolved, the king was back in charge. But not in the way he had been. The American defeat had been a personal disaster for him and dramatically weakened his political position. In an effort to reassert it, he'd installed a 24-year-old as Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer, thinking that here at least was a politician he could control. The king himself was actually quite popular. He was generally seen as a kind-hearted, slightly bufferish sort of a person, but he was still ultimately in charge of what was going on. And when even Pitt insisted that Catholics would have to be allowed the same rights as Protestants and permitted to stand for Parliament, George forced him to resign. He made a slow recovery, enough to sack his ministers in 1805 when they tried to lift the restrictions on Catholics becoming military officers. But he was becoming blind and infirm, and in 1810 his mind finally collapsed.